Welcome to the Discover Bittensor podcast. My name is Nick, and the objective of this podcast is very simple to help normal people understand Bittensor. Because right now, almost nobody does. So let me start with a strange observation. Over the past year, I've had the same conversation many times. I tell someone about Bittensor, they look at me slightly confused, and then I try to explain the idea. And somewhere in the middle of that explanation, something interesting happens. They pause and they say something like, wait, that's actually a really crazy idea. Not crazy in the usual crypto way, not like this coin will go to the moon, but more like in the older sense of the word. Crazy like, if that actually works, it would change a lot of things. And that reaction kept happening. So eventually, I realized something. Maybe Bittensor isn't difficult because the idea is small. Maybe it's difficult because the idea is so big. Big enough that it's hard to explain in a single sentence. Big enough that it takes a bit of time to understand what people are actually trying to build. And that's exactly why this podcast exists. It's not to hype Bittensor, but simply to explore one question. What exactly is this new thing called Bittensor? Before we talk about Bittensor, we need to talk about AI. Artificial intelligence is rapidly becoming one of the most powerful technologies in the world. And that's no longer speculation because you can see it basically everywhere around you. AI writes emails, it generates images, it helps programmers write code, it summarizes research papers, it answers questions, and it's just the beginning. And this is only the beginning. We are probably still in the early chapters of the AI story, but there's something interesting. Almost all of the most powerful AI systems today come from a very small number of organizations, such as OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, or Meta. And these companies are building extraordinary technology, but they also control it. They control the models, the infrastructure, access. And that's not necessarily wrong, but it raises an interesting question because whenever something becomes critical infrastructure, people eventually start asking who gets to build it, who gets to control it, and who gets the upside. Think of electricity, railroads, the internet. All of these eventually raise the same question, and artificial intelligence is now entering that territory as well. Which brings us to Bittensor, because Bittensor starts with a very unusual idea. Instead of asking, how can one company build the best AI, Bittensor asks something different. It asks, what if intelligence could be built by an open network? Not one lab, not one model, but thousands of contributors spread across the world, competing and collaborating at the same time. And here's the key idea. Instead of one company deciding what AI research matters, the network itself tries to discover what is valuable through incentives and competition and economics. So in other words, Bittensor is trying to create something that doesn't really exist today, a market for intelligence. And that's a very unusual concept, because normally we treat intelligence as something produced inside organizations, such as research labs, companies, or universities. But Bittensor explores a different possibility. What if intelligence itself could become something like a global marketplace, where people contribute useful models and the network rewards the ones that provide real value? That is the core experiment. To understand why that idea is interesting, we need to talk about open source, because open source software changed the world quietly, without much drama. A huge portion of the internet runs on open source infrastructure. Servers, libraries, operating systems, cloud software, and Linux is one of the most famous examples. It powers enormous parts of the internet, but most people using the internet have no idea it's there. Open source solved a huge problem: permission. Anyone could contribute, anyone could build, and anyone could improve the system. But open source also left another problem only partially solved: incentives. Many of the most important technologies in the world were built by developers who captured very little of the financial upside. The value often accumulated around the technology. Companies built businesses on top of it, but the infrastructure itself remained economically thin. Bittensor tries to change that. It attempts to combine two powerful ideas: the openness of networked collaboration, and the incentives of a market. In simple terms, it tries to reward people who contribute useful intelligence. That's the experiment. And if that works, it could create a very different model for building AI. So, inside Bittensor, the network is organized into something called subnets. You can think of a subnet as a small digital economy focused on one type of problem. One subnet might focus on language models, another one might focus on coding agents, another might focus on data analysis, another on image processing, and each subnet defines a specific task. Participants build systems that try to solve that task, and the network rewards the participants whose outputs are most useful. It's a bit like a continuous tournament. Different models compete, validators evaluate performance, rewards are distributed based on results. So instead of one giant AI system, you get a landscape of specialized AI economies, each experimenting with different IDs, different models, different evaluation systems. It's actually much closer to an ecosystem than to a company. Now here's where things get really interesting. The hardest problem in Bittensor is evaluation. Because if you want to reward useful intelligence, you need to answer a very difficult question. What counts as useful? How does the network decide which models actually provide value? And this is the core design challenge of the system. Because if you can't measure usefulness properly, the entire economic model falls apart. But if you can, something fascinating happens. You create a system where incentives push participants to produce better intelligence, not because a boss told them to, not because a company demanded it, but because the economic rewards naturally flow toward the most valuable contributions. In theory, that creates a continuous discovery process. The network constantly searches for better intelligence and rewards the people who find it. Now let's talk about Tau, because if Bittensor is the organism, Tau is the energy that keeps it alive. Tau is the currency of the network, but it's not just a payment token. It's the mechanism that connects all the incentives. The network continuously distributes Tau to participants who contribute value: miners, validators, subnet builders. The better your contribution, the more rewards you receive. This creates a feedback loop. If the network produces useful intelligence, participants are rewarded. If they don't, they earn less, or nothing at all. And over time, that dynamic pushes the system toward better outputs. At least that's the idea. Whether it works perfectly is still an open question, but the architecture is designed to align incentives with usefulness, and that's a very big deal. Now here's the part I personally find most fascinating. There's a pattern that repeats throughout the history of technology. First, something looks experimental, messy, fragmented. Builders argue about details, interfaces are rough, reliability isn't perfect. Then, something surprising happens. If it works, it disappears. Not because it failed, but because it became infrastructure. Most people don't know what operating system powers their phone. Most people don't know how DNS routing works. Most people don't know what kernel powers cloud servers. They just open an app and it works. Linux followed that path. Today Linux runs enormous parts of the digital world, but most users have no idea it exists. Some people believe Bittensor could follow a similar trajectory. If developers start building useful AI services on top of subnets, the network might eventually power tools used by millions of people around the world. Coding assistants, AI infrastructure, inference services, data networks, and the users might never realize Bittensor is underneath it all. Just like they don't realize Linux is underneath much of the internet today. That's the infrastructure scenario, and it's one of the reasons people are paying attention to Bittensor. There's another unusual aspect to the system. In traditional technology markets, most of the early upside is locked inside private companies. Before the public can participate, the major allocations are already made. Think about Anthropic or OpenAI, which are set to go public this year. But that's just simply how venture capital works. Bittensor introduces something different. Subnet economies allow open participation in emerging experiments. anyone can allocate capital, anyone can support projects, anyone can move capital between subnets. It creates something closer to a liquid market for early innovation. Now, that doesn't mean every experiment will succeed, many won't. But structurally, it creates a different environment for experimentation and participation. And that's one of the reasons some investors and builders find Bittensor so intriguing. Now, before we get carried away, Bittensor is still extremely early. Like, if you're listening to this podcast, you're extremely early. Many ideas are still very experimental. There are real challenges, technical challenges, economic challenges, and governance challenges. Can useful intelligence be measured reliably? Can incentive systems resist manipulation? Can subnet economies attract real demand? These are open questions, and we'll explore them throughout this podcast, because understanding the risks is just as important as understanding the possibilities. So why am I doing this podcast? Well, because I believe Bittensor sits at the intersection of several important ideas: AI, open systems, incentive design, digital infrastructure. And when those things combine, sometimes you get noise, but sometimes you get the early outline of something historically important. I don't know for sure which one Bittensor will become, but I do know this. It's one of the most interesting experiments I've seen in how intelligence might be produced and coordinated in the future. And that makes it worth understanding. So in this podcast, I'll explore Bittensor step by step. I'll explain how subnets work, how miners and validators interact, how the incentive mechanisms operate, and where the system might succeed or fail. Because whether Bittensor ultimately works or not, the ideas behind it are fascinating. And understanding those ideas might tell us something important about the future of AI. So if you want to explore these concepts further, you can visit my website, discoverbittensor.com, where you'll find beginner explanations and deeper analysis of the ecosystem. So thank you very much for listening, and welcome to the journey of discovering Bittensor.